Welcome, listeners, to a deep dive into a topic that has, well, profound global implications and is often really oversimplified. What would truly happen if military action were taken against Iran's?
Yeah, it's a huge question.
And today we're going to unpack this using a fascinating, really comprehensive source, a final report from the Swedish Defense Research Agency, the FOI. It looks at the consequences of military action.
Right, and it's worth noting this report came out in 2007.
It did, but its scenario planning, the whole multidisciplinary approach, it still feels incredibly relevant for understanding these kinds of cascading effects too.
Absolutely. Our mission today is really to go beyond just the headlines. We want to explore those potential ripple effects, domestic, regional, international, economic, even the legal side.
So multiple angles.
Exactly. And it's really crucial, to understand this report focuses on scenarios and consequences. It's not trying to predict the likelihood of anything.
Okay, that's a key.
It is. And grasping that is pretty key to understanding the depth of the analysis here. This deep dive should help you navigate the nuances of what is, let's face it, a really highly charged subject. It gives you a framework.
Okay, so let's unpack that framework a bit. The FOI report, it explicitly asks about the consequences of military action on Iran's nuclear infrastructure. But you're saying it's not a crystal ball, not predicting what will happen.
Absolutely not a crystal ball, no. The report outlines the political and strategic context, and it presents two plausible U.S. military operations scenarios against Iran's nuclear sites.
Plausible scenarios.
Plausible, yes. But, and this is vital, it does not assess how likely these attacks are. It just doesn't go there.
So the scenarios are more like starting points.
Exactly. They're a foundation to then analyze the knock-on effects, both domestically inside Iran and internationally.
Okay.
And what's really fascinating, I think, is how they do this. The report relies on something called scenario theory.
Scenario theory.
Yeah. It helps decision makers by laying out future development that, that cannot be excluded. Things that have a non-zero possibility, even if they seem unlikely.
So it forces you to think about the uncomfortable possibilities.
Precisely. It forces an awareness of all the uncertainties out there and theoretically helps shorten reaction time if things suddenly change in a radical way. It's not about guessing the most likely future.
Right. It's about preparing for a range of futures. That's a really powerful way to think about it. And it sounds like they put a lot of effort into building these scenarios.
Oh, they really did. It was a huge undertaking. The report mentions this multidisciplinary approach, about 15 experts involved.
15?
Yeah, from fields like military operations, energy, regional studies, terrorism, nuclear energy. They all got together in a workshop in March 2007.
So bringing all these different perspectives together.
Exactly. And then to top it off, it was informed by an international conference later that year in October 2007. They had input from figures like Gary Samore, who was with the Council on Foreign Relations. So real depth.
Okay, so using this robust framework, this scenario approach, what does the report suggest would be the immediate fallout inside Iran if an attack happened?
Well, the assessment in the report is pretty stark, actually. It suggests military actions would likely strengthen the hardline and militaristic elements within the Iranian regime.
Strengthen them, not weaken them.
That's what the analysis suggests. And at the same time, it would likely weaken the reformists, both those inside the government and, activists outside.
Why is that?
Well, the report describes the Iranian government at that time as, quote, unpopular. And it argues they had a vested interest in portraying Iran as being under siege.
Okay.
So an attack basically hands them a justification on a silver platter. The regime can present itself as a victim of aggression, tapping into historical grievances like Western support for Iraq during the Iran-Iraq War.
Right. That narrative of victimhood becomes a powerful tool.
A very powerful tool for consolidating power, the report suggests.
And what about the nuclear program itself? You mentioned the report draws a parallel with the Osirak reactor bombing in Iraq back in '81. How does that comparison work here?
Yeah, that's a really key parallel they draw. The Israeli bombing of Iraq's Osirak reactor, well, it didn't stop Saddam Hussein. If anything, it boosted his determination to get WMD capability.
So the attack backfired.
You could argue that. And the report suggests something similar could happen with Iran. The Iranian ambitions to rebuild its nuclear industry would likely be strengthened by an attack.
Strengthened. And what about international agreements?
Well, it seems probable, according to the report, that Iran will just withdraw from the Nuclear Non-Proliferation Treaty, the NPT.
Pull out of the NPT entirely.
That's the assessment.
Yeah.
Which would allow it to pursue a covert nuclear capability without the inconvenience of having International Atomic Energy Agency, the IAEA, inspectors looking over their shoulder.
Okay, so potentially driving the program further underground.
Potentially. And the report also touches on another internal aspect. Could an attack destabilize Iran along ethnic lines.
Ah, right, by perhaps supporting separatists.
Exactly, like in provinces, say, Sistan, Baluchistan, or Khuzestan. But the report suggests that's actually unlikely to get broad support within Iran. The chances of success are seen as low.
And potentially dangerous.
Very dangerous. There's a significant risk it would just backlash, triggering a really strong wave of nationalism. And then you'd see repression of minority groups who get painted as, foreign agents.
Right, rallying around the flag effect, potentially. Okay, so that's the picture inside Iran. But the report also looks beyond its borders, doesn't it? What about the wider Middle East?
Oh, yes. Here's where the ripples really spread out. The assessment is that military actions would further intensify the geopolitical power plays and competition already happening in the region.
Intensify existing rivalries.
Exactly. Make them even more acute. And a major reaction expected from Iran, according to the report's scenarios, would be an increase and a broadening of asymmetric warfare using proxies.
Asymmetric warfare through proxies. Like who? Where?
Well, likely targets would include U.S. troops and installation, particularly in places like Iraq and Afghanistan at that time.
Okay.
The report goes into some detail on concerns about Iranian influence in Iraq back then. It talks about the IRGC's Quds Force, that's their external operations unit supporting Shiite militants, with training, weapons, funding, often channeled through Hezbollah. The report even mentions U.S. military briefings from July 2007.
What did they say?
They indicated that top Iranian officials, based on interrogations of captured figures like Qais Khazali and a Hezbollah operative named Ali Musa Dakduk, had advanced knowledge of specific deadly attacks against U.S. soldiers.
Advanced knowledge. That's significant.
Very. And the U.S. response at the time, you might remember, included designating the IRGC as a global terrorist organization in September 2007, trying to hit their financial interests.
Right. And what about other groups? Hamas, for instance.
Iran's influence there is also highlighted. Hamas, the Palestinian movement, had declared Iran its strategic depth. They were getting substantial support, financial, training, weapons, both directly and via Hezbollah, especially after their election win in 2006.
So Iran potentially activating or intensifying these proxy networks across the region.
That's a major part of the predicted regional fallout, yes.
Okay, let's dive deeper into Iraq specifically, given its importance back then. How would the different factions within Iraq react to a hypothetical U.S. strike on Iran?
Right, it's complicated. On an official level, you'd expect the Iraqi government to condemn the attack, call for a ceasefire, maybe offer to mediate. That's the diplomatic face.
But underneath,
much more complex. Among the Shiite factions, for instance, you have groups like the Supreme Iraqi Islamic Council, SIC. They were founded in Iran, got funds and intelligence from there.
So strong ties.
Very strong. Iran was described as the backbone of the SIAC's existence. But an attack puts them in a really tough spot. They wouldn't want to jeopardize their own position and gains within Iraq by condemning the U.S. too strongly.
A delicate balancing act for them.
Extremely delicate. Now, flip that coin. Many Sunni groups in Iraq, they'd likely welcome an attack on Iran.
Welcome it. Why?
Well, they'd hope it would severely weaken Iran and, consequently, Iran's influence over the Shiite-dominated government in Baghdad. The report even suggests some Sunni groups might offer the U.S. intelligence.
Interesting. But with a condition?
Yes, a big one. That support would be decisively influenced by the longevity of the attack. How long it goes on for would really matter to them.
Okay, that makes sense. Let's shift now to the bigger global chessboard. How would major players react? Israel, Russia, Europe? And what about international law?
Let's start with Israel. But from an Israeli perspective, as the report analyzes it, their security doctrine has historically leaned heavily on military preemption against perceived threats.
Like the Osirak attack we mentioned.
Exactly. That's the prime example. And Israel has often acted without broad international support, sometimes with surprisingly minimal political cost, you could argue.
But Iran is different.
The report suggests it is. For an attack on Iran, it argues the probability of complete success is low, the risks are very high, and the costs in terms of a guaranteed violent counterreaction from Iran are pretty much certain.
Low probability of success, high risks, certain costs. Not a great equation.
Not at all, according to this analysis.
Yeah.
Now, Russia's position, especially back in 2007 when the report was written, was particularly complex.
How so?
Well, Iran was described as a long-time stable partner, even a friend that Iran can trust. That was, quote, attributed to President Putin back then. Russia didn't view Iran as a sponsor of terrorism, supported its role in the SKO, the Shanghai Cooperation Organization.
And economically.
Trade had tripled between 2000 and 2006. Mostly Russian exports to Iran stuff for the Bushehr nuclear power station, energy investments, weapons. Russia even floated ideas like an energy club within the SKO, a kind of gas OPEC, including Iran.
A gas OPEC. Wow, Iran has huge reserves, right?
Second largest natural gas reserves in the world. So yeah, significant potential there.
But were there tensions, too?
Oh, definitely. Conflicting interests. The trade was very lopsided in Russia's favor. Russia actually benefited from Western embargoes on Iran in some ways, and of course their competitors in the oil and gas markets.
Right, and the nuclear program itself, how did Russia view that?
Their stance evolved. Initially, they seemed to view it as peaceful, but they got more worried after the IAEA found undeclared activities in 2005, Iran withholding information, enriching uranium.
So they started applying pressure.
They did. Russia supported Iran signing an IAEA additional protocol in 2003 for more intrusive inspection. They said they'd only finish the Bushehr reactor if Iran agreed to send the spent fuel back to Russia, preventing potential plutonium extraction.
Any other proposals?
Yeah, Russia proposed joint ventures for enrichment, maybe outside Iran, or fuel supply deals. These ideas got some international traction. And then, in December 2006, Russia actually voted for a UN Security Council resolution imposing sanctions on Iran.
Sanctions, so they did shift.
They did shift, though they insisted on making the sanctions pretty mild. But then, interestingly, in December 2007, this was after a U.S. intelligence report came out saying Iran had likely stopped its nuclear weapons program back in 2003. Russia finally announced it had started delivering nuclear fuel to Bushehr.
Timing is everything, I guess. So how would Russia react domestically to a U.S. attack, according to the report?
Domestically, the prediction was a very negative reaction in Russia, driven by nationalism, anti-American sentiment, which was high then due to things like NATO enlargement and the Iraq War. You'd expect strong public condemnation.
And the Russian military?
They'd likely condemn it very strongly, too.
Yeah.
And probably use it as justification to push for increased defense spending, especially on things like air defense.
Okay. What about Europe? NATO. You mentioned divisions during the Iraq crisis earlier. Could we see a repeat?
The reports suggest that's highly possible, yes. An attack on Iran could definitely polarize the EU and NATO again. Remember, Iraq. France was pushing hard for a common EU position against the war.
While others lined up with the U.S.
Exactly. Britain, Denmark, Spain, Italy, Poland, Hungary, Czech Republic. They declared loyalty to the U.S., caused huge internal disagreements.
So a U.S. request for support could split Europe again?
The report argues it could exacerbate those divisions, almost like a divide and rule situation, because ultimately, most European countries still saw the U.S. as their main security guarantor.
And there's one specific factor mentioned for Europe: nuclear weapons.
Yes, that's highlighted as critical. If the U.S. were to use nuclear weapons in an attack, well, the report calls that unprecedented in the post-WWII period.
Unprecedented.
And it predicts it would lead to very negative public opinion across Europe, especially in Germany, France, Italy, Spain, but even in Britain. It would be a massive political firestorm.
A huge red line for European opinion. Okay, this brings us to the legal question. What does international law actually say about something? Is military intervention permissible?
Well, the basic principle of international law is that countries are prohibited from using military force against each other. It's a cornerstone of the UN Charter.
So, are there exceptions?
The report outlines two theoretical possibilities where U.S. attacks might be permissible. One, if they were mandated by the UN Security Council, which seems highly unlikely in this kind of scenario.
And the other?
The other is if the strict criteria for preemptive self-defense are met.
Preemptive self-defense, what does that mean legally?
It's a very high bar. The report cites the classic definition from the 1837 Caroline Affair that involved a British attack on a U.S. ship supplying rebels in Canada.
Okay.
The criteria require the threat to be instant, overwhelming, leaving no choice of means, and no moment for deliberation. Basically, you're about to be attacked right now.
So not just a potential future threat.
Exactly.
Yeah.
The report points to historical examples like Japan's invasion of Manchuria or Italy's attack on Abyssinia, which claimed self-defense but were widely rejected. Even Israel's 1981 Ozark attack was condemned by the UN Security Council as violating the UN Charter.
So how does a potential U.S. attack on Iran stack up legally, according to the report?
The report is unequivocal. It states that U.S. attacks cannot possibly meet the criteria for preemptive self-defense.
Not possibly.
That's the phrasing. It argues such attacks would be even harder to justify legally than Ozark was. They'd constitute a clear violation of international law and also specific IAEA conventions on nuclear safety.
A clear violation.
Yes, although the report does add a rather pointed comment that the Bush administration at the time hadn't paid much attention to international law and other instances, implying that legal concerns might not be the deciding factor anyway.
Right. Realpolitik might trump legal arguments. Okay, we've covered the geopolitical angles, the legal side. What about the economic impact? How does Iran's economy fit into this, and what are the global implications?
Well, Iran's economy, as described in the 2007 report, was seen as pretty fragile and unbalanced, heavily dependent on oil exports.
How dependent?
Around 80% of its exports in 2005 were 80%. And remember, Iran has huge reserves, second largest oil reserves globally, fourth largest producer at the time.
So could they use oil as a weapon? Cut off supplies? Disrupt shipping through the Strait of Hormuz, maybe?
They could potentially try. Disrupting traffic through Hormuz is a classic scenario, but the report points out Iran's own heavy dependence on oil export revenue. An embargo would put the government in a really difficult spot financially.
A double-edged.
Exactly. And there's another vulnerability. Iran actually needed to import petrol back then because it didn't have enough domestic refining capacity, despite all that crude oil.
So hitting refineries could be significant. What about the global economy?
The report suggests Iran's direct connection to the global economy was somewhat limited, apart from oil. But the timing of an attack could be crucial. If it happened during a period when global markets were already shaky, it could be, quote, the final blow to an already shaken market sentiment.
So potentially triggering a wider crisis depending on context.
Potentially. However, the report is pretty explicit in saying that the global economic fallout would most likely not be a decisive factor in whether the U.S. decided to launch attacks or not.
Other factors would likely weigh heavier.
That seems to be the assessment, yes.
Okay, one final area. Military strategy. What impact could this kind of action have on how wars are fought, on military thinking?
The report indicates that an attack on Iran would likely consist primarily of airstrikes, maybe some limited ground operations by special forces, rangers perhaps, but mostly air power.
Right.
And if that approach were deemed successful, the report suggests it would reinforce the trend we've seen in modern warfare, emphasizing air power and special ops as the key assets.
So confirming that strategic direction.
Potentially, yes. Now, the direct cost of a short campaign to the U.S. military budget might be fairly insignificant in the grand scheme of things.
But longer term?
The long-term costs could be substantial. It really depends on the follow-on strategy. For instance, if the U.S. decided it needed to sustain no-fly zones over Iran, similar to what happened in Iraq for years, well, that gets very expensive very quickly.
Sustained commitment means sustained cost.
Yeah.
Got it. Wow. This deep dive, it really hammers home this sheer interconnectedness and complexity of any military action like this.
It really does.
It's not just about hitting a target. It's this cascade of effects, political, economic, regional, legal.
A whole web of consequences.
Yeah. And understanding these scenarios, even based on this 2007 analysis, it still helps make sense of a world that often feels pretty unpredictable, doesn't it? It gives you tools to think through possibilities.
Absolutely. And if we connect it back to the bigger picture, the report offers one final, quite striking interpretation.
What's that?
It suggests that having an external enemy, like the U.S. was often portrayed, has actually been, quote, very beneficial to Iran's government over the years. Yes. Serving an important role in propping up the Iranian regime and elites, it helps maintain internal cohesion, distracts from domestic problems.
That's a fascinating point.
It raises a really important question, doesn't it? What happens to a government's position, its legitimacy, when that external threat seems to diminish or disappear? What happens when popular attention turns inwards towards domestic issues?
A powerful thought to leave our listeners with. Food for thought indeed. Thank you for joining us on this deep dive.
My pleasure.
And to our listeners, keep digging, keep questioning, and keep learning.